Putin's been formally inaugurated today for his fifth term in office, 6-year term, which will bring him up to 2030. And the way things are going, he's probably going to surpass Stalin if he's still alive. And then after Stalin, it will only be Catherine the Great among all Russian leaders. Um, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to reflect on Putin's legacy. It goes without saying that I'm not a fan of Putin. I think he is a tyrant responsible for causing misery to millions of people. And I genuinely believe the world will be a better place when Putin is gone. I sincerely, genuinely believe that. Um, Now, just to play the devil's advocate for a split second, can we point to anything that could be said for Putin? I guess you could say early in his tenure, he restored a bit of self confidence to Russia. It had been damaged in the post Cold War years. Yeltsin mismanaged the economy. Russia was in a bad state. So I suppose you could argue early in his tenure, Putin did restore some of that national confidence. Of course, he has gone too far and he's become, if he wasn't already, an outright tyrant. I sort of think we can look at Putin in roughly three stages. There's sort of what I call the new Putin, that is when he was a relatively young new leader. He was a fresh face, there was a bit of ambiguity with Western leaders, um, some optimism, but also it was clear this is a serious person, not, even then, I think there was always a sense of don't get on the wrong side of Putin. Then there was a middle Putin, which was kind of a bit unstable and erratic. And, it was sort of like increase in tensions with the West. And then I think what we have now is an old Putin. I mean, literally, he's 71. But I think this Putin is more like Andropov or Brezhnev or even Stalin. He's a tired old tyrant. And I know that he made a speech today aimed at the West. I didn't listen to it. Frankly, I put it on mute because I think there's nothing original to say about that. There's nothing that he would come out with that's worth any original commentary. Um, the inauguration itself, it took place in the Kremlin buildings. I understand. Ornate buildings, they always do this thing where the door opens and he comes through. Among the guests in attendance was Steven Seagal, one of the most prominent Putin stooges in the West. Seagal was asked by a BBC journalist why did he support Putin. Very straightforward and reasonable question. Seagal had a little tantrum and he said, if you're stupid enough to ask that, I can't answer. And, he had a little huff about it. Um, my message to Steven Seagal and other Westerners who support Putin is really put your conviction where your mouth is. I mean, if he hasn't done so already, I think Seagal should just, I know he's got joint Russian citizenship or something, but I think he should just live in Russia and be done with it. Because Putin's created such an environment that maybe Seagal thinks he's comfortable because he's a Putin supporter. But the thing about dictatorships is there's this great myth that they provide stability. Actually, I think it's a facade of stability because behind when you have that fear, when you have that paranoia, anything can happen. So even those who ostensibly would be pro-Putin might one day find themselves being accused of opposing the tyrant. So, Seagal can make his bed as far as I'm concerned. To hell with him and to hell with all Westerners who support Putin. I have zero respect for them. I think they're beneath contempt. Why do I believe that? Because most of them still live in the West. Most of them, take all the advantages of the freedoms we take for granted, freedom of speech, and so on. They can say things in the West that you absolutely, as a dissident, could not say in Russia. And what do? They support a foreign tyrant who has threatened the West, a tyrant who has brutalized dissidents in Russia. That is his record. And I'm going to analyze it a bit more here. If you're expecting any sort of balance or nuance with this, you're not going to get it. I frankly hate Putin, and I think his record is an appalling one. Like I say, I played the devil's advocate for a bit. He provided a little bit of confidence and perhaps even economic growth in the beginning of his tenure. Well, what do you have now? You have economic stagnation. Russia's the 11th biggest country in the world by nominal GDP, well below Britain. as a matter of record. Um, its growth is lackluster at best. Um, on the world stage, it has been to a large extent polarized. I'm not going to say completely, because it doesn't have the sort of strained relations with, say, India or some other countries in the developing world as it does with the West. That is true. But that doesn't mean, even countries like India, which have sat on the fence, and I think India's position is very questionable, but even with that, they haven't come out right and supported Russia absolutely 100%. Even China hasn't done that. So really, the only states that are fully supporting Russia, like completely, and remember that UN vote over the invasion of Ukraine, i.e., for an immediate pullout from Ukraine, it was almost unanimously against Russia. So even those countries that seem to sit on the fence, so they wouldn't necessarily be pro-West, they're not overtly pro-Russia either. The only true friends Russia really has at the moment is Belarus, possibly North Korea, and a couple of other totalitarian states like Eritrea. Even China, on the surface, China and Russia obviously have good relations. They have a vested interest against the West. But the other thing to be remembered about Russia and China, they're both big countries. So at the moment they're getting on well, but they have actually had a history of tensions. There was a Sino-Soviet split in the 60s, and basically they're both big countries. So realistically, there isn't going to be a natural process where they're going to be really solidly working together all the time. I think it's kind of a facade of camaraderie, to let's do two fingers to the West, but you'll probably find that if there was a world which was just Russia and China dominating, they would be at loggerheads. So the only reason they're allied is because they both have vested interests against the West. That's it. Um, I mean, there's little else in common other than the totalitarianism. Um, the demographics of both countries are very different. China's a fast rising economy, it's a huge population. Russia's a declining population and a stagnant economy. There's differences there in the demographic sector. Um, but if we look at Putin's record, he has created a society of absolute fear and paranoia um, based on ultra-nationalism. I mean, you can't really do a vox pop in Moscow or St. Petersburg and expect an entirely reliable response, because in dictatorships, people will say what they feel, understandably, what they feel is the safest thing to say. Um, so, you will get people praising Putin. Some of them may genuinely feel that way. I don't underestimate the power of nationalism in Russia. I think some of that is genuine support. But I also think there will be people who say that because they know the consequences of publicly criticizing Putin. They know it. This is the atmosphere he has created. Um, I think the thing about stability is a myth. Look at the attempted coup last year. That doesn't happen in France or Britain. Um, it's so for Russia, for anyone to say that his dictatorship has brought stability, that's questionable. His legacy is not only the brutal subjugation and attempted genocide of Ukraine. I mean, I say attempted genocide. I think it is cultural genocide because Putin denies Ukraine's very existence as a nation state. That actually fits the definition of genocide, trying to eradicate a way of life, trying to eradicate people. The mass deportation of Ukrainian children has sinister echoes of, again, what Stalin done. Make no mistake about it, whatever excuses are made for Russia, the notion of NATO enlargement or what have you, the fact of the matter is Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Russia has long bullied smaller neighbours. That record speaks for itself. Russia has propped up the Assad dictatorship in Syria, so by extension, Putin also has the blood of thousands of Syrians on his hands. He's caused instability across Africa, propping up military juntas there. This is Putin's legacy, and in my opinion, it is a thoroughly disgraceful one. Um, he's absolutely crushed opposition at home. He's created jingoism. He's brought back effectively Cold War Mark II with his obsessive irredentism, his Western phobia. And those who say that the West gloated when Russia lost the Cold War, consider this. Consider this. Russia was a member of the G8. Russia was treated as an equal in the G8. In 2000, when the Kursk submarine disaster happened, Britain and Norway offered to assist Russia, and Putin shunned that assistance. So anyone who wants to say this is the West being provocative or Russophobic, look at the number of Russians who've worked in London as business people. That's the opposite, surely, of being Russophobic. The fact that we've been so tolerant of Russian nationals freely operating in this country. Um, so, in the end of the day, I think there will be people who defend Putin, probably for two reasons. There are some who really do have this kind of perverse idolatry towards so-called strongmen, and they look up to dictators. I think such people are morally bankrupt. There will be others who do it not necessarily because they genuinely like Putin, but for whatever reason they're anti-West. I think this is the case with a lot of Indian nationalists because they feel that the West is too pokey or too scrutinizing of their politics. Um, some of them, frankly, still have a chip on their shoulder about the British Empire. I'm going to say that. I think that's part of it. So they just feel the need to kind of vocalize support for Putin, not necessarily because they genuinely admire, but he's anti-West. I think when it comes to India, of all countries, India is the one I'm most disappointed by. You know, China, I'm not surprised. India is supposed to be a democracy. I think it's been an utter failure of the Modi government to take that position of power and influence to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. Um, and you know, those who want to say this is kind of the developed world versus the rich West, Ukraine wasn't exactly a rich country either. You know, Ukraine could be seen as a middle income country. It wasn't exactly a rich Western country. Um, and it's been subjugated by Russia. So I honestly have very, very little patience with Russia apologists, or I'll rephrase that, Putin apologists. Um, this is depressing, you know, to see that the tyrant remains in power. If Even if you're anti-West, think of what he's done to Russia. Think of the thousands and thousands of young Russian men killed and maimed for his irredentist obsessions. Um, for what? You know, even if Russia wins this war and takes over Ukraine, is that a price worth paying? Because what they will have is millions of Ukrainians bitter to what they will see as an occupying power, and you'll have a guerrilla campaign against that. So Western Putin stooges like Trump, you know, he says he'll end the war on day one. If that means selling Ukraine to Russia effectively, that'll be a false peace because I guarantee there will be a guerrilla war against Russia. You know, if Russia, excuse me, if Ukraine formally falls, i.e., the Zelensky government falls, you'll have a guerrilla campaign against Russia. Absolutely. It'll be far, far worse for the Russians than Afghanistan was. So, I don't know how anyone could look to what Putin has done in Russia and say it's anything good, other than this false facade of, oh, he's a strong man, he's still in power. He's went through, what is it, 4 or 5 American presidents and 7 or 8 British prime ministers, what have you. Um, is that evidence of strength in itself? It just shows he's a dictator. That's all it shows. Ultimately, I think Putin's scared. Like all dictators, he's fundamentally a coward. Um, because he cannot tolerate the idea of critique. There isn't really much more to say, but I think of those courageous Russians who stood up against him. I think of the courage they have contrasted to the utter cowardice and moral bankruptcy of those who defend Putin. Um, but I do believe this man has caused misery for a lot of people. I think he's a malevolent influence in the world. And the day he falls from power, whether from natural death or another successful coup, I honestly think it will be good for the world. Because even if he's succeeded by another dictator, that other dictator won't have the power that Putin has, the influence over time. But what is the power for what it's done to the Russian people? You know, a stagnant economy, polarizing the world stage to a large extent, thousands of young Russian men whose lives have been sacrificed. That's his legacy.